Welcome back. In this second video we're going to take a look at the first of our essential chord progressions, the 1, 4, 5. This is arguably the most important chord progression of all. If you've ever come across the term 3-chord trick, these are the 3 chords that it's referring to. I should perhaps point out at this stage that it's not my intention in these videos to teach any specific chord fingerings. It's more an exploration of how chords are constructed and how they connect together in a musically meaningful way. If you need to learn the fingerings for particular chords, there are of course copious examples in my own book, but there are also a number of excellent chord dictionaries available both in print and online. So, to start off, why 1, 4, 5? Well, very simply, it all goes back once again to the major scale. We saw in the last video how we can construct chords by taking as a starting note or root note any of the notes of the major scale and adding alternate notes from the scale to build a simple 3-note chord or triad. And the number of the chord simply takes its identity from the degree of the scale on which you start. So if we build our chord starting on the first or tonic note of the scale, then the root of our chord is note 1, and we call this the 1 chord. So we've seen that the intervals within that chord are then a major third and a fifth, making this chord a major triad. Now by convention the chord numbers are written in Roman numerals, and to denote that this is a major chord it's written in capitals. So the number for this chord is a capital Roman 1, or in the English alphabet an I. We can repeat this process taking as our root note the 4th note of the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4. Again taking alternate notes from the scale, this gives us notes 4, 6 and 8. Creating our 4 chord. And if we examine the pattern of intervals, you'll see that this is exactly the same as the pattern on the 1 chord. So we have a 3rd and a 5th. So once again this chord is a major triad. So our 4 chord is a major, denoted by capital Roman numerals for 4, or IV in the English alphabet. We repeat the process for note 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which means we take notes 5, 7 and 9. At this point you may say to yourself, didn't we say that the last note of the scale is note 8, or the octave, so where's this note 9 coming from? Well, all we're doing here is starting to replicate the same pattern an octave higher. So note 9 is simply an octave above note 2. So we could say that our 5 chord is built from notes 5, 7 and 2 of the major scale. And we can see once again it's the same pattern of intervals. So we have a root, major third and a 5th. So once again we have a major triad denoted by capital Roman 5 or V in the English alphabet. So we now have our 3 chords, 1, 4, 5, which completes our sequence. Now, to identify what these chords are, we're playing this in the key of C. So our starting or tonic note is C, so the root of our 1 chord is C. So our 1 chord is a chord of C major, which we can play in full in this position. If we follow the alphabet up the scale, our 4 chord will be C, D, E, F. So our 4 chord is a chord of F major. We can drop that F down an octave to this position, and then form the F chord over all 6 strings. That manner, giving us a 1, 4. The 5 chord will be C, D, E, F, G. So our 5 chord is now a chord of G major. Once again we can drop the G down an octave and form our G chord in the conventional open position here. So we now have a complete 1, 4, 5 chord progression in the key of C major. The question now is, what is so important about this chord progression? Well, first off, within these 3 chords you can find all the notes of the corresponding major scale. This means that any melody written using the notes of that major scale can be harmonised using just these 3 chords. By harmonised we mean that for every note of the melody there is at least 1 chord which contains that note within the chord. And this is the normal way that we find a chord to accompany a melody. We find a chord that includes the melody note and play it along with the tune. So, once again, any tune that can be written using the notes of the major scale can be harmonised in a simple way using the chords of the 1, 4, 5 progression. Now this is true of other sets of 3 chords, so there must be something else special about the 1, 4, 5. It has a number of interesting characteristics, but perhaps the most important is to do with cadences. If you're not familiar with the term, cadence is simply a fancy word for ending. This could be the ending of a complete piece of music, the ending of a verse or a chorus, movement of a symphony, or another significant phrase or passage within the piece. And far and away the most common cadence is the so-called perfect cadence, and this consists of a progression from the 5 chord to the 1 chord. That should be a fairly familiar sound to you. Another popular cadence is the so-called plagal, P-L-A-G-A-L cadence. Don't worry about the technical names for now. Just remember that this is a cadence which moves from the 4 chord to the 1 chord. Sometimes called the Amen cadence because this is a very popular cadence for ending hymn tunes and church music. A third cadence, which occurs quite frequently, is the so-called imperfect cadence. Imperfect because it doesn't, in this case, return to the 1 chord, but instead ends on the 5 chord. There are a number of chords that can precede the 5 chord, but very commonly it will be preceded by the 1 chord, creating the imperfect cadence. So these 3 important and common cadences can all be found within our 1, 4, 5 chord progression. So, to summarise, we have a chord progression which can be used to harmonise any melody and which allows us to use the most common cadences of the perfect cadence, plagal cadence and imperfect cadence. In popular music, the 1, 4, 5 chord progression is the basis of the 12-bar blues. This is a hugely influential song form which has fed into music not just in blues but also in jazz, in soul, country, Latin, right up to contemporary popular styles. And a simple basic 12-bar blues might consist of 4 bars of the 1 chord, followed by 2 bars of the 4 chord, returning to the 1 chord, 4, 5 again to the 5 chord, back to the 4 chord, back to the 1 chord. So as you can see, not exactly in the sequence 1, 4, 5, but using just the 3 chords from the 1, 4, 5 chord progression. So, an extremely useful chord progression, and when it comes to practicing and learning these progressions, my recommendation is to practice them in all possible keys. So for example, we've just learnt this in C. If we take that scale and move it down to the key of G, in other words our starting or tonic note is G, using exactly the same pattern of tones and semitones to form the major scale, using the same system to generate the chords, so starting with a root of G, we get a G major for the one chord, going up to the fourth, G, A, B, C, get a chord of C major for the 4 chord, and G, A, B, C, D, chord of D major for the 5 chord. So we now have a 1-4-5 progression in G, consisting of G major, C major, and D major. And this system can be extended through all the available keys, and this is going to be the topic of our next discussion in the next video, when we'll be discussing keys in a little more detail and learning the cycle of fifths. If you're not familiar with that already, tune in next time. Thank you and goodbye.